open, devout socialist running against Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary. And there's also Governor O'Malley, but O'Malley really hasn't taken off on the Democratic side as people kind of thought that he might. That still remains to be seen if he does take advantage of some of the opportunities that lay ahead of him. But, on the Democratic side, we're not seeing specific plans laid out. So on the Republican side, we're going to see a robust primary, not on the Democrat side. So again, folks, we've got on the line now Brian Brown from the National Organization for Marriage. He's the president of that organization. He is one of the key social conservative leaders in this country. So Brian, we had worked together on this big story the other night in response to Senator Rubio's pretty much complete cave, and also Governor Bush from Florida, complete cave to the gay marriage ruling from the Supreme Court. Can you tell us, what it is about what Senator Rubio said that really ticked you off?
Well, I mean, look, almost all the candidates very quickly got out there and condemned the ruling and also pointed a way forward, which is supporting a constitutional amendment that will allow the people to decide this issue, take this out of the hands of the courts, or define marriage as a union of a man and a woman. It was quick. Governor Walker, Governor Walker, Huckabee, Santorum, person after person stood up. Senator Rubio was very disappointing, steps up and says, look, I don't want to amend the Constitution. I don't want to do the one thing that is a clear path towards overturning the Supreme Court decision. And it was very disappointing. Instead, Senator Rubio wants us to just deal with the effects of the decision, the attacks on religious liberty. Well, that's fine, but you're not going to fully protect religious liberty as long as you have a Supreme Court who is willing to willy-nilly create a right to same-sex marriage out of thin air and enforce it on the entire country. That's just not acceptable, and it's not acceptable to have candidates who are so weak that they're not willing to even stand up for the party platform, which calls for a constitutional amendment protecting marriage. So it was very disappointing, and I was, happy to point out the fact that this is a big failure on the part of Senator Rubio and Jeb Bush, and I don't see how social conservatives can support them if they continue to refuse to support a clear path to overturning this decision.
Now, what's really interesting too is so obviously the decision came down 5-4, and when we're looking at the Bush apparatus over the last, there were obviously two previous President Bushes, and there's a third Bush vying to be the president, and fourth, really, if you count their protege Marco Rubio, because again, Marco Rubio was trained by Jeb Bush to be everything that he is, and so as we look forward to the 2016 election, and this Republican primary really should be a place where we can have a discussion about who should really be our Supreme Court justices, because obviously earlier in the week, too, we saw John Roberts lead the charge again to uphold Obamacare, of all things. I mean, he was given to us by President Bush. What do you think, as we look forward to the 2016 election, the discussion needs to, what is an acceptable answer? What do these candidates need to be talking about when they're talking about vetting judicial appointments, especially since we're going to have several probably Supreme Court seats come up for appointments in probably the next administration?
Well, I mean, the upcoming presidential election is everything for the issue of marriage, because as you just said, there's two ways to overturn this decision. One is through a constitutional amendment. That's going to be a long, hard fight, but it's a fight worth having. The second is electing a president who will nominate to the Supreme Court constitutionalist justices. And anyone who looks can see that the Republicans have not done very well at this. Democrats are basically batting 100%. They get ideologically who they nominate, and they almost 100% find in a way that the quote unquote progressives want. Republicans have had a horrible track record at this, and this has to change. And one of the ways that it has to change is that we are doing a presidential pledge. We're asking each of the Republican candidates, just as we did in 2012, and even Governor Romney signed our pledge in 2012. This year, we are asking all the candidates to sign the pledge, and one of the key points of the pledge is a commitment to overturn this decision and to nominate constitutionalist judges to the Supreme Court. And the only way we're going to get that is to get someone who's willing to be a leader on the marriage issue, not someone who just gives lip service to it. We're at a point where we have an imperial judiciary, and we need presidential candidates who are able to articulate that, oppose that, and are very clear in their judicial philosophy that they're not going to have another justice who betrays the core principles of the Constitution, and that's what happened with Justice Kennedy in the Overturn decision.
Okay, and so now we've talked about how at this time Senator Rubio and Governor Bush are pretty much unacceptable to social conservatives in the Republican primary in 2016. Now, you kind of mentioned a couple of these guys. Now, who is it that is emerging as acceptable alternative Republican candidates? Who's actually leading the way in this really vast Republican field that we're seeing take shape? I think there's 20 guys running for president. Who's catching your attention? Has anybody signed your pledge yet? Who should people who care about this stuff be looking at in 2016?
Well, we're not going to start announcing the pledge signers until later next week. We gave folks some time to sign. I will say we have had folks sign, and I'll also say that very clearly, Bobby Jindal, Senator Santorum, Governor Huckabee, all have been leaders on this issue. But one thing I've been surprised about, because I was disappointed in Governor Scott Walker during when the state Supreme Court, the federal court, after forced same-sex marriage on Wisconsin. At the time, I thought that he had a very weak response, which is basically, for us, this is over. He's been tremendously good on this issue lately. He has supported a constitutional amendment that will allow the people to decide the issue of marriage, would overturn this decision. And so, I've been impressed. I've been impressed with Governor Walker reaching out and meeting with social conservatives in D.C. If people have made mistakes in their past, it's important that they stand up now. And, again, Governor Walker has been doing a very good job on that. So I think that those have sort of been the leaders. I think Perry could have been stronger. I don't think it's acceptable to simply say, now we're going to only focus on religious liberty. That's not an acceptable response. Just like Roe, these presidential candidates need to work to overturn a horrendous decision.
Now, you mentioned how last cycle Governor Romney, who was obviously the more establishment side of the party nominee, right, an eventual nominee, signed the National Organization for Marriage pledge, and that means that pretty much the entire Republican Party, at least at one point, had supported what we're talking about here. Now we have two of the most major candidates are walking away from it entirely. There's some other guys who aren't even talking about this stuff. What happened? Why is the Republican Party moving away from this stuff? Why should they not be moving away from it? What happened in the politics here? Why are these guys wrong?
Well, they're wrong because what they're doing is listening to the New York Times and the inside the Beltway bubble. The reality is they're being told that the people have abandoned the marriage issue. This is fundamentally false. What we've seen are the courts are forcing this on the country. This was not a public vote. We're still 32-3. That's an amazing record for public referenda on marriage, and we still show very strong support for marriage by Republican voters. It's obvious, it's clear. We're in the 80%, 90% range. And if you ask the question directly, even in the broader public for voting, we're still over 50%. You don't hear that because the New York Times, the Washington Post, these CBS want to run these polls that are very stilted, the same sort of polls we've seen in states saying we're going to lose in North Carolina. We won by 61%.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a mistake politically. It's also a mistake of principle. Voters want people who will stand for the truth. They want people who will stand up for what they believe in, even if they may have disagreements. They don't want people, waffling away. Mm-hmm. So I think on both counts it's wrong, and I think it's definitely wrong when it comes to who's going to win the Republican primary. In Iowa, in South Carolina, in state after state after state, Republican voters are going to be the ones deciding who's the next Republican candidate. And they're not going to accept someone who's running away from an issue as important as the issue of marriage and the very nature of what sort of government we live under. Do we live under a government in which the people get to decide, or do we live under a government where Justice Kennedy gets to decide something as important as the very nature of marriage?
All right.
Go ahead.
We gotta cut to commercial here, Brian. So I want to really thank National Organization for Marriage President Brian Brown for calling in. We're going to take a quick commercial break. Again, folks, it's Breitbart News Sunday. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back after this with Penny Nance from Concerned Women for America to go more in depth on this.